Hello and welcome to Support Life, a new program that approaches current social issues from a life-affirming perspective. I'm John Hendriks, and in the coming weeks we'll be interviewing people from diverse backgrounds in the community, professionals, politicians and people from various community groups. Today we are joined by Robert Dugdale from Catholic Voices Australia. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you, John.
How are you?
I'm very well. Yourself?
Very good, thank you.
That's great.
Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what you do.
Sure. Catholic Voices was originally established in the United Kingdom. They recognised that the Catholic Church has a great message to sell, a very positive and beautiful message, but it's not often portrayed that way nor communicated that way. And so, just prior to the Pope's visit in 2010, they established Catholic Voices, which was a movement that enabled young Catholics to sell their message, but to get out there and communicate the truth around what the Church teaches, how it teaches that, and why it teaches that. And Australia, earlier this year, became the 10th country to come on board in what's become a very positive and successful global movement, and I'm very privileged to be a founding member of that movement.
Excellent. Sounds very exciting in the near future.
It is exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the things that face our social issues, our society today, some of the pro-life issues that we're covering in this program.
Yes.
Perhaps you could tell us what is the current abortion law in Victoria?
Abortion law in Victoria changed significantly in 2008 with the enactment of the Law Abortion Reform Act. And what that did was, originally it was framed around decriminalising abortion in Victoria, but as you and I know, it went much further than that. So some examples include the removal of a freedom of conscience for health practitioners and professionals working in the area of abortion. It also involved the allowance of abortions not just at 22 weeks, which had been, I guess, perceived as the benchmark prior to that, but up until birth. So partial birth abortions are now legally permitted in Victoria, and numbers suggest that they've increased significantly since the enactment of that legislation. Minors are not required to receive any consent from their parents. There's no opportunity, or there's no requirement for them to seek advice or guidance. They can have an abortion and not necessarily be supported by their families, which is something that's also we've seen increasing. And we've also seen a great increase in gender selection abortions, so people choosing to abort their child because it isn't the sex that they desired.
That's incredible, isn't it? I don't think many of our viewers would have been aware that that's the current law in Victoria. When was that law passed? What year? Or
it was passed in 2008. And after a relatively short consultation period and a relatively short debate in Parliament. And I guess it was communicated quite strongly at the time that this debate would be occurring, but the details of the legislation were not publicly known, and certainly not widely publicised, I should say. So in my conversations with whether it be colleagues, peers, most of them are not aware of the significance of this piece of legislation, and specifically not aware of the fact that late-term abortions are legal in Victoria, partial abortions are legal and increasing, and that the removal of freedom of conscience has occurred. So,
I heard that under the current law, that if a baby was born alive, is there something in the Act that says the child is not given any medical assistance or any treatment whatsoever? Can you confirm, is that correct?
No pain relief is afforded to aborted babies in situations where they're partially born and then terminated. No pain relief is afforded to that particular baby, which is inconsistent with some of the guidelines that we see around animals who are afforded pain relief, yet in the situation of human life, no such pain relief is afforded.
That's incredible. And can you tell us, Robert, under the current Law Reform Act, how does it affect the medical professionals, the health professionals in our state? How does it affect them?
Well, a good example is a young doctor who goes to medical school with a view of of promoting life, supporting life and protecting life could very well be put into a position where they're forced to either conduct an abortion themselves or be complicit in the termination of an unborn baby. So in an emergency situation, that doctor is required by law to conduct an abortion. In a non-emergency situation, the health professional or doctor is required to refer that patient to someone whom they know will conduct that abortion. So they're either directly involved or complicit, which is of course being directly involved,
Yes.
which is a removal of freedom of conscience, which is a basic human right to all persons, and specifically to doctors, or particularly to doctors, where you're dealing with human life on a day-to-day basis. But of course their conscience, their freedom of conscience is removed under legislation.
That's incredible, isn't it? Because I know that under many other professionals, they're allowed, like lawyers, I mean, they have their conscience as to what they're allowed to do and not do, but medical practitioners are not allowed under the Act currently, and if they do, I believe there is a current example of a particular doctor that went out and publicly said that he didn't agree with it, and he's currently being investigated. Is that correct?
That's right. Well, Dr. Mark Hobart is that example, and he could be the first situation where this legislation will be tested. He declined to refer a patient for an abortion, and he's now being sanctioned by the medical board, and could potentially face charges from that.
That's incredible. On that note, we're going to take a short break. Please stay with us, and we'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to Support Life. I'm John Hendriks, and I'm with Robert Dugdale, my guest today from Catholic Voices Australia. Welcome back, Robert.
Thank you.
We were talking earlier about the current abortion laws and how it affects medical practitioners. Recently, I attended a march in the city a couple of weeks ago, March for the Babies, who was a pretty successful walk, and a lot of people felt very passionate that they wanted to express their views. What's your take on that?
What had originally intended to be a peaceful march, as had been for years previous, it turned out to be quite a confronting and potentially violent situation. So I think it's incredibly disappointing when a march that exists to promote life and support life is hijacked by people who are incredibly angry for no other reason than to oppose the views of those who want to support life. I don't think it's a situation for us. I'm not suggesting we should be angry at them. I think we should be disappointed in the situation that we've come to as a society, where a march to support human life, unborn human life, is seen as something that's violent.
Yeah. The March for the Babies, I'm told the date coincides with the passing of legislation in 2008. You were saying off camera that you followed the debate and you were in Parliament that day?
Yeah, I followed a lot of the debate, and I was in Parliament for a lot of the debate, just in the gallery watching as an everyday person. And it was very interesting to hear the different views. It was also very interesting to hear the views of those who stood up to speak about life and to talk about, whether it be talk about the procedure of abortion, whether it be talk about victims of abortion, not just children, but mothers and fathers who have been through a situation of aborting a child and then dealing with the post-traumatic stress or grief that comes with that, sometimes 10 or 15 years later. It was interesting to hear how those conversations were shamed and really put down as not necessarily being in the light of the debate in Parliament, because I think that those issues should be paramount to shaping and framing the way legislators go about creating legislation that affects the society and the community. So in many ways, I felt that some of the most important aspects of the debate were shut down because they didn't quite suit the ideological view of those proposing the legislation.
Yeah, and I have to agree with you on that. And having witnessed the march for the first time myself a couple of weeks ago, and my family was there, we felt that there were a lot of people that were genuinely there for no other reason than that they felt moved, that they had to express that they just don't agree with this current legislation, the current law. Perhaps you can explain, a little bit more about, the March for the Babies and how that, how that's affected our state of play.
When it comes to the March of the Babies, I think it's really important to identify that it's about life. It's not a religious movement, it's not a march for Catholics or any other denomination, it's about life. And many of the placards I saw being held up illustrated people saying, I've had an abortion and I've suffered as a consequence of that. So these are people who are speaking firsthand of the trauma they've experienced, and they're speaking firsthand. They're a great witness because they're not there because they're compelled. They're not there because their church is dragging them along or for some ridiculous reason. They're there because they want to be there to support life, to hold a balloon and bear witness to the fact that they're suffering at the hands of legislation that should be enacted to protect society, but it's not. It's letting us down, and I think that's a great shame.
The current state government is sympathetic towards a possible change to Section 8, which is the act about the conscientious vote. And there were, on the day of March for the Babies, I'm told there were 5 MPs that actually walked that day too. So my understanding is it's gaining momentum through Parliament. What's your understanding of that?
Since 2008, there's been a growing movement to challenge Section 8 of the Abortion Law Reform Act. It's completely unjustified, and it's in direct conflict with the basic of human rights. It says we have a right to a freedom of conscience. And so legislation that strips that away contradicts everything that we understand about our rights as human beings. There's been a growing movement. I think the March for the Babies, its growth each year, and then again this year, of course, being so significant, illustrates that movement growing and developing. It illustrates that the public is becoming aware of the damaging effects that this legislation is having. Again, not just to the unborn, but to victims of abortion being mothers and fathers and families. And it illustrates that the fact that the 4 MPs were marching, organised by Bernie Finn, that there is growing support within the Parliament itself, for us to revisit this legislation.
And we're not looking to condemn people that have perhaps been involved in a termination, but what we're looking to do is make people aware. That's why the March for the Babies was there, is make people aware about the circumstances that affects their decision. And what about the support or lack of support perhaps for people who have either had an abortion or considering having an abortion?
That's a really good point, because I think in many cases the March for the Babies is seen as a way of pointing the finger or laying blame at those who are either seeking abortion or terminating their pregnancies. But that's not the case at all. I think we need to be really clear about that. It needs to be about supporting mothers and fathers who are in that situation to say that's not the only option. If someone feels as though a termination is their only option, then the state's failed them. We've failed that person straight away. So how can we arrive at an avenue where if someone finds themselves in that position, we can say to them that their options aren't necessarily abortion. Their options could be seeking support, seeking counselling, adoption's an opportunity. But how can we as a state better support that person to raise that child within its biological setting?
Absolutely. Thank you for explaining that. Just on that note, we will need to take a break. Please stay with us and we'll be back very shortly. Welcome back to Support Life. I'm John Hendriks and my guest today is Robert Dugdale. Hello, Rob.
There you go.
Good, thank you. We were covering the points. About the March for the Babies.
Yes.
And we spoke in detail about people that were moved, that were there, and all of the different experiences that the message is trying to get across. Our viewers watching today, if they're moved to do something about it, what could they do?
Well, there are several things, there are numerous things that people can do to show support for any Act of Parliament or any view on a social issue. We can write letters to our members, local parliamentarians. We can show support by becoming involved in a lot of the social media that's been driven not just from the March for the Babies, but just generally for pro-life movements. And I think what has been a taboo subject is now starting to be talked about a little more freely, especially in social media, where people tend to feel more comfortable having a conversation because they're not necessarily personally being the mouthpiece. They can do it through the medium. And so I think there's some really powerful messages being sold through, whether it be multimedia clips on YouTube, whether it be conversations on Twitter, postings on Facebook, witness accounts. So that's a really powerful movement as well. But I personally believe that the conversation needs to be had, and where I've always had the most success is just through discussing this issue, whether it be over dinner with friends, whether it be speaking to colleagues and peers, and just letting them know. I mean, in a very compassionate way, that this legislation exists and that it's not necessarily what they might perceive it to be. So I know, for example, late-term abortions and partial birth abortions is usually something that people have no idea exists under the current Abortion Law Reform Act in Victoria, and that is always an eye-opener.
I was, having said that, I was recently at a party, at a function, and I mentioned the same thing you've just said to a couple of people, and they had absolutely no idea. In fact, one of my friends is a doctor, and we had a cup of coffee and we were discussing this very topic about Section 8.
Yes.
And I asked him what was his take on the current abortion law and what did he think. And he wasn't aware that there was Section 8 involved, and he wasn't even aware that abortions were legal in Victoria after 20 weeks.
That's right. No, I would argue that there are a significant number of doctors and health practitioners who are not aware that the legislation impinges upon their own rights and in terms of their freedom of conscience. But it's also important to note that the legislation extends not just to doctors but to health practitioners and health professionals. It's also important for legislators to bear in mind that consistency in legislation is important too. So we're in a situation where some legislation, certainly in the past, has recognised the unborn, and now we have new legislation which is suggesting that it's all right to terminate the unborn. And so where does that leave us in terms of consistency with our legislation? Is this a life or is this not? And I don't think that the law really has that well understood, and I don't think that there's a great consistency in that. So
there seems to be a lot of contradiction in our community about how much time and effort we will go to save a life if a baby is born premature. We've seen papers written and examples in the local papers, our daily papers, written about babies who are born after 22 weeks, 24 weeks, and most of them will survive and they can survive, but yet people are saying today that it's only a fetus, it's only a bunch of cells, yet it's actually really a baby, isn't it?
I attend a lot of breakfast conferences and things in my capacity, in my role as working in business. And I attended one several years ago by a very well-known leader in Victorian health from a Victorian hospital. And that particular person talked about the challenges of having one floor trying very hard to save the lives of babies at 22 weeks, and another floor of the hospital terminating the life of babies at that very same age. And so that creates a very interesting case study as to what is human life and how we're going about protecting human life, and what is the consistency. If one human life is worth saving at that time and it's acceptable to terminate the life of another at that time, when does the rights of that baby enter into the conversation, and do the rights of that baby enter into the conversation at all? And the argument is, at this particular point, there's a very big gap, and we're missing something pretty important.
It's a very, very exciting and intriguing topic, because there's also about when is it the mother's choice. There's all those arguments about, is it her choice, or is it actually another life in there? Where's the person that stands up for the second life, the unborn life? Currently, I'm aware that there is no legislation that protects the unborn child, but it is being tested in a case where someone has had a car accident, I think, something like that, and the child was died, the unborn child died, and there's a current litigation. So there's going to be a lot of interesting examples of that over the next coming few years in our society. But nevertheless, there's a lot of discrepancies, and it's really hard for people out there to understand exactly what is right, what is wrong, what is morally right, what is illegally wrong.
Yeah. Well, the argument has always been that the baby is not a baby. But we know that science doesn't necessarily support that argument anymore. I have a child myself, and of course you go and get ultrasounds, and my daughter was born premature. And so we had a cesarean section, and she was born prematurely. But at that very same age, when her life was supportable and she was as a healthy young baby girl, at that same age, somebody else could justify terminating the life of their baby at that age. And so, again, the rights of the child, but how do we go about understanding if this is a baby or if this is not a baby, and we're terminating that life, then there's a great inconsistency.
What do we do? Absolutely. Well, that brings us to the end of the show, and thank you very much for coming on and speaking. It's been absolutely delightful to have you, Robert.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Support Life. We'll be back next week with another interesting guest. Please do follow us then.